The morning my husband tried to kill me started like any other Tuesday in our pristine suburban home in Cedar Ridge, Illinois. I was standing at our granite kitchen counter, scrolling through emails on my phone, when I caught my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. 32 years old, successful marketing director, designer clothes, perfect makeup even at 7 a.m. From the outside, I had everything. But reflections lie, don't they? Before I tell you what happened that day, what my husband Marcus did to me, and what I did back, I need you to understand how I got here. And if you're watching this from somewhere in the world where you've ever felt trapped, ever felt like you were living a lie, drop a comment and let me know where you're from. Because what I'm about to share with you, it could happen to anyone. My name is Sarah Chen Morrison, and 6 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream. Marcus and I had been married for 8 years, together for 10. We met at Northwestern University. He was in his final year of law school, I was finishing my MBA. He was everything my immigrant parents wanted for me: successful, ambitious, from a good family. His father owned a chain of car dealerships across the Midwest. Old money. Established. Marcus was charming in that effortless way that comes with privilege. He never had to try too hard because everything had always been handed to him. When he proposed to me at the Chicago Botanical Garden on a perfect May evening, with a ring that cost more than my parents' first car, I said yes, not just because I loved him, but because I thought I was supposed to. You know how some relationships feel like work from day one, but you convince yourself that's what love is? That the constant walking on eggshells, the way you start editing yourself, shrinking yourself to fit into their world, that's just compromise? I spent 8 years believing that lie. The first few years were good, or at least I told myself they were. Marcus landed a position at his father's friend's law firm, specializing in corporate litigation. I climbed the ladder at Henderson Marketing Group, eventually becoming their youngest ever director at 29. We bought the house in Cedar Ridge, a sprawling 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a yard that Marcus never helped maintain but loved to show off during our elaborate dinner parties. Those dinner parties. God, how I grew to hate them. Every month, Marcus would invite his colleagues, his father's business associates, the other couples from our country club. I would spend days planning the menu, cleaning the house until it gleamed, buying new clothes because Marcus always had something to say about how I presented myself. "Sarah, honey, maybe something a little more conservative," he'd suggest, his voice dripping with that condescending sweetness I'd learned to recognize as a warning. I became an expert at playing the perfect wife. Smiling at his slightly off-color jokes, laughing at stories I'd heard 100 times, never expressing an opinion that might contradict his. When someone asked about my work, Marcus would jump in, "Oh, Sarah's little marketing job keeps her busy." Little. As if the 6-figure salary I earned, the campaigns I created that won national awards, the team of 15 people I managed, as if all of that was just a cute hobby. But here's what I want you to understand, and maybe this will resonate if you've been there too. I didn't see it happening. The slow erosion of who I was. The way my confidence got chipped away, comment by comment, suggestion by suggestion. It's like being slowly poisoned, except the poison is psychological, and you're the one administering it to yourself because you've been convinced it's medicine. Marcus never hit me. I want to make that clear because I spent years thinking that meant everything was fine. He never raised a hand to me, never called me names, never obviously crossed lines that I could point to and say, "This is abuse." Instead, it was death by 1,000 tiny cuts. The way he'd sigh when I expressed excitement about a work project. How he'd forget important events that mattered to me but remember every detail of things that mattered to him. The subtle ways he isolated me from friends, always with reasonable explanations that made me feel selfish for wanting to maintain those relationships. My best friend from college, Jennifer Park, used to call me every week. We'd talk for hours about everything: work, dreams, stupid reality TV shows. But Marcus would hover during those calls, making faces, tapping his watch, clearing his throat loudly. Eventually, he started scheduling things during our usual call times. "I thought we could go to dinner," he'd say, "and how could I choose a phone call over quality time with my husband?" Gradually, those weekly calls became monthly, then sporadic, then almost nothing. Jennifer stopped calling, probably thinking I was too busy with my perfect life to maintain our friendship. The same thing happened with my work friendships, my college roommate who lived in Denver, even my relationship with my younger sister Amy. Marcus was never outright controlling. He was too smart for that. Instead, he created an environment where choosing anyone or anything over him felt selfish, felt wrong. And I believed it because I loved him, and because the alternative, admitting that my marriage was a mistake, felt impossible. By last year, my world had shrunk to our house, my job, and Marcus's social circle. I told myself I was happy. I had everything I was supposed to want: a beautiful home, a successful husband, financial security, a good reputation in our community. When people asked how married life was treating me, I gave them the same bright smile and said, "We're so blessed." But late at night, when Marcus was asleep beside me, I would stare at the ceiling and feel this gnawing emptiness in my chest. I felt like I was disappearing, like the Sarah who used to have opinions and dreams and spontaneous ideas was slowly being erased. I started having anxiety attacks, sudden moments where I couldn't breathe, where the walls of our perfect house felt like they were closing in on me. I went to see Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a therapist in downtown Elmhurst, about 6 months before that Tuesday morning. I told Marcus I was going to a new dermatologist, another lie in a marriage built on thousands of tiny deceptions. Dr. Martinez was the first person in years who asked me what I wanted, how I felt, what I dreamed about. And you know what? I couldn't answer her. I literally sat in her office, 32 years old, and realized I had no idea who I was anymore. That's when I started to wake up. Slowly, like coming out of a long, medicated sleep. I began to see the patterns, the ways Marcus controlled our life together without ever seeming controlling. How he made all the major decisions while consulting me just enough to maintain the illusion that we were partners. How our conversations revolved around his work, his interests, his opinions. How I'd stopped buying clothes I liked, cooking foods I enjoyed, even listening to music that wasn't on his approved playlist. 3 months ago, I decided I wanted to go back to school. Get my PhD, maybe transition into teaching. Or consulting. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, researching programs, imagining a different future. When I brought it up to Marcus over dinner at our favorite restaurant, Chez Laurent, where he proposed, his reaction told me everything I needed to know about our marriage. He didn't get angry. That would have been too obvious, too ugly for our public image. Instead, he got that look. You know the one, the expression that says you've just revealed yourself to be fundamentally naive, childish, unrealistic. "Honey," he said, cutting into his filet mignon with precise movements, "don't you think we have enough on our plates right now? With the house, and my partnership track, and your demanding job? Maybe this is something to revisit in a few years." A few years. Always a few years. When I was 24 and wanted to travel through Europe before settling down, maybe in a few years, when we're more established. When I was 28 and wanted to adopt a rescue dog, let's wait until we buy the house. When I was 30 and brought up having children, I want to make partner first. Give it a few more years. I was 32 years old, and I'd been living in a few years for my entire adult life. That night, I lay awake listening to Marcus's steady breathing and made a decision. I was going to apply to PhD programs. I was going to start making choices based on what I wanted, not what he thought was practical or appropriate or convenient for him. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt enormous. I should have known that Marcus would find out. I should have been more careful. The first sign that Marcus knew about my graduate school applications came 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening in early September. I was in our home office. Well, what used to be a guest room before Marcus decided he needed a home office for his important work, which mostly consisted of video calls with clients and online poker games he thought I didn't know about, printing out some marketing campaign proposals for Monday's client meeting. Marcus walked in without knocking, something he'd started doing more frequently lately. He had that casual, almost friendly expression that I'd learned to fear more than his anger. When Marcus was openly upset, at least you knew where you stood. But this look. This was the look he got when he was planning something. "Hey, babe," he said, leaning against the doorframe in his weekend uniform of khakis and a polo shirt. Jennifer Park called the house phone earlier. Something about a girls' weekend in Madison next month. My stomach dropped. I hadn't talked to Jennifer in months, not since Marcus had successfully made those calls feel like a betrayal of our marriage. But more concerning was the way he mentioned it, too casual, like he was testing me. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "That's nice of her to think of me. I should probably call her back." Marcus stepped into the room, and I could smell his cologne mixed with something else. Bourbon, probably from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer at work. She mentioned that Dr. Martinez recommended some weekend retreats for professional women. Funny thing to bring up. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. Dr. Martinez. Jennifer had never met Dr. Martinez. The only way Marcus could know that name was if he'd been going through my things, my emails, my phone. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in on me like they did during my anxiety attacks. "I don't know what you mean," I managed, but my voice came out strained. Marcus smiled, that patient, condescending smile I'd grown to hate. "Sarah, honey, we don't keep secrets from each other, do we? I mean, marriage is about honesty, trust, partnership." He emphasized that last word like it was a weapon. "So when I find out my wife has been seeing a therapist for months without telling me, naturally I'm a little concerned." He'd been going through my credit card statements. Of course. I'd been so careful to pay Dr. Martinez in cash after the first session, but that first payment had been on our joint account. I felt stupid, naive, like a child trying to hide something from a parent who was always 3 steps ahead. "It wasn't a secret," I lied. I've been having some anxiety. Work stress. I didn't want to worry you." Work stress. He repeated it like he was testing how the words tasted. "And this work stress required you to see Dr. Martinez every Tuesday for 6 months? That's pretty serious stress, Sarah." Every Tuesday. He knew my appointment schedule. Had he been following me? Tracking my phone? The realization hit me like a physical blow. My husband had been surveilling me. The man who slept next to me every night, who I made breakfast for every morning, who I'd promised to love and honor and trust, had been treating me like a suspect in my own life. "Marcus, And then there's this." He pulled out his phone and showed me a screenshot. It was an email confirmation from Northwestern University, acknowledging my application to their doctoral program in communications. The timestamp showed he'd accessed my email account 3 hours ago. The room was spinning now. My carefully constructed secret life, therapy sessions, graduate school applications, the small acts of autonomy I'd been building like a foundation for a different future, all of it exposed. All of it turned into evidence of my disloyalty, my deception, my failure as a wife. "I can explain," I started, but Marcus held up a hand. "No need to explain, babe. I understand completely." His voice was so gentle, so reasonable. "You've been under a lot of pressure. Work, keeping up with the house, all the social obligations. It makes sense that you'd feel overwhelmed, start making some questionable decisions. The important thing is that we caught this early, before you did something you'd regret." Something I'd regret. Like pursuing education was a crime. Like wanting to better myself was a betrayal. Applying to graduate school isn't a questionable decision, Marcus. It's my life, my career. "Our life," he corrected, his tone sharpening just slightly. "Our career. What affects you affects us both. And honey, you have to see how this looks. Going behind my back, keeping secrets, seeing a therapist who's probably filling your head with all sorts of ideas about independence and self-actualization. It's textbook." Textbook what? Midlife crisis. Early midlife crisis. But still. Very common in women your age, especially high-achieving women who start questioning whether they've made the right choices. He said it like he was diagnosing a medical condition, his lawyer's voice calm and authoritative. "The good news is, it's completely treatable. We just need to get you back on track." Back on track. Like I was a train that had derailed, not a person trying to find her way back to herself. That weekend, Marcus launched what he called Project Reconnect. He cleared his schedule, something he'd never done in 8 years of marriage, and planned a series of activities designed to remind me why I'd fallen in love with him, why our life together was perfect, why I didn't need therapy or graduate school or any kind of life outside the one he created for us. We went to the Art Institute of Chicago, where Marcus stood behind me at every exhibit, his hands on my shoulders, explaining each piece like I was a child who couldn't read the placards myself. We had dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, and Marcus spent the entire evening reminiscing about our early relationship, painting our history in golden tones that bore no resemblance to my actual memories. "Remember how you used to laugh at all my jokes?" he said over dessert. "You had the most beautiful laugh. You should laugh more often." I should laugh more often. At his jokes. For his pleasure. The implication was clear. I'd changed, and not for the better. The woman he'd fallen in love with was gone, replaced by this anxious, secretive person who needed therapy and had crazy dreams about graduate school. If I wanted to save our marriage, I needed to become that laughing girl again. Sunday evening, after our weekend of forced romance, Marcus suggested we look at our finances together. "I think it would be good for us to get on the same page about our goals," he said, spreading out bank statements and investment portfolios across our dining room table. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Over the past 2 years, Marcus had been quietly moving money out of our joint accounts into individual accounts in his name only. Our savings account, which I thought had nearly $50,000, actually had less than $5,000. Our investment accounts had been liquidated and reinvested in his name. Even my 401k from work had been partially transferred to accounts I couldn't access. "I wanted to consolidate our investments," he explained when I questioned him, his voice patient like he was teaching me basic arithmetic. "Get better returns. Simplify our portfolio. Don't worry about the details, babe. I've got it handled." But I did worry about the details, because the details told a story that made me sick to my stomach. Marcus had been systematically gaining control of our finances, leaving me with access only to our checking account and my work salary. If I wanted to leave, though he never said those words directly, I'd be leaving with almost nothing. That night, I called in sick to work on Monday and spent the day at the Oak Park Public Library, using their computers to research financial abuse. The term felt dramatic, too serious for what was happening to me. Marcus wasn't hiding money in offshore accounts or forcing me to sign over my paychecks. But as I read article after article, story after story, I recognized the pattern, the gradual assumption of financial control, the way he discouraged me from paying attention to our investments, how he positioned himself as the financial expert while treating my questions as cute but unnecessary. I also researched divorce laws in Illinois. What I learned terrified me more than anything else. Because Marcus was a lawyer with connections throughout the legal community, because he controlled most of our assets, because I'd been complicit in maintaining the facade of our perfect marriage for so many years, leaving him wouldn't just be difficult, it would be financial and social suicide. But staying was killing me slowly, day by day, decision by decision. I felt like I was drowning in my own life. That Tuesday, I had my regular appointment with Dr. Martinez. Except when I got to her office, her receptionist told me there had been a scheduling mix-up and I'd need to reschedule. It wasn't until I was driving home that I realized Marcus had probably called and cancelled my appointment, maybe even told them I wouldn't be needing their services anymore. When I got home, Marcus was waiting for me in the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and that patient, loving expression that I now recognized as barely contained fury. "We need to talk," he said. The conversation that followed was the moment I truly understood who I'd married. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten me outright, didn't do anything that would leave visible marks or create evidence of abuse. Instead, he methodically dismantled every aspect of the life I'd been trying to build outside of our marriage. He'd already called Northwestern and withdrew my application, he informed me calmly. Used his legal credentials and our joint tax returns to prove he had the authority to speak on my behalf. The admissions office was very understanding, he said, when he explained that his wife had been going through some mental health challenges and had made the application during what was clearly a manic episode. Mental health challenges, I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Well, what would you call it, Sarah? The lying, the secret therapy sessions, the impulsive decision to completely uproot our life without discussing it with me. He stirred his tea methodically, the spoon clinking against the ceramic in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Dr. Martinez was very helpful when I explained the situation. She agreed that couples counseling would be more appropriate at this stage. Dr. Martinez would never have discussed my case with Marcus. Patient confidentiality laws prevented that. But Marcus was a lawyer. He knew exactly what to say to make his story sound plausible, even to me. And the fact that he'd somehow gotten my therapist to stop seeing me individually told me he'd found some way to pressure her, probably through legal threats or professional connections. You had no right. I had every right, he interrupted, and for the first time, his mask slipped just slightly. I'm your husband, Sarah. That means something. It means we're a team, partners in everything. When you go behind my back, when you make major decisions without consulting me, you're not just betraying our marriage, you're betraying yourself. The woman I married would never have been so selfish. Selfish. There it was, the word that had been lurking under every conversation we'd had for years. My ambitions were selfish. My friendships were selfish. My desire for education, for growth, for any kind of life that wasn't entirely centered on him and his needs, all of it was selfish. That night, I pretended to go to sleep while Marcus worked late in his home office. But I lay awake until I heard his steady breathing, then crept downstairs to the kitchen. I needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to escape this marriage that had become a beautiful, expensive prison. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at our kitchen island, staring out at the backyard that Marcus had landscaped without asking for my input. Even our outdoor space reflected his taste, his vision of what our life should look like. Perfectly manicured hedges, a fountain he'd special ordered from Italy, flower beds arranged with mathematical precision. No space for wildness, for spontaneity, for anything that grew outside carefully planned boundaries. As I sat there, I started to understand something that would change everything. Marcus wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. Not in the way that would land him on a true crime podcast, but dangerous in the way that emotional abusers are always dangerous. He was willing to destroy my mental health, my career prospects, my relationships, my financial independence, anything that threatened his control over me. And I realized something else. I was going to have to be just as dangerous to get free. Over the next few weeks, I began what I can only call my own covert operation. I couldn't openly defy Marcus anymore. He'd proven he had too many ways to sabotage me. Instead, I had to become as strategic and calculating as he was. First, I started documenting everything. Every conversation where he diminished my accomplishments, every suggestion about my appearance or behavior, every instance of him making financial decisions without consulting me. I kept a small notebook hidden in my car and wrote everything down immediately after it happened, dating each entry. I also started taking photos of important documents when Marcus wasn't around, bank statements, investment records, insurance policies. Second, I began rebuilding my support network, but carefully. I couldn't risk direct contact with Jennifer or my other old friends. Marcus was clearly monitoring my communications. Instead, I created a new email account using a computer at work and began reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. My college roommate Lisa, who lived in Portland now. My cousin David in California. People who remembered who I used to be before I became Mrs. Marcus Morrison. Third, I started preparing financially. I couldn't access our major accounts, but I began setting aside small amounts of cash from my grocery budget, from the household expense account Marcus gave me access to. $20 here, $50 there. I opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town and started keeping my documentation and cash there, along with copies of important documents. But the most important thing I did was start researching Marcus himself. You'd think after 8 years of marriage, I'd know everything about my husband. But the more I dug into his background, the more I realized how much he'd hidden from me. I used my marketing research skills to investigate him the way I'd investigate a client's competitors. And what I found made me understand that leaving him wasn't just necessary, It was urgent. Marcus had been married before. Not just a college girlfriend or a brief starter marriage, but a 4-year marriage to a woman named Catherine Walsh that he'd never mentioned to me. Ever. I found their wedding announcement in the Chicago Tribune archives from 2008, divorce records from 2012. Catherine had filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, but when I dug deeper, I found a police report from 2011 where she'd called for a welfare check because she was afraid of what her husband might do. The police report was brief, professional, and chilling. Catherine Walsh had told officers that her husband Marcus Morrison had been increasingly controlling and paranoid, that he'd accused her of having affairs, that he'd been monitoring her communications and following her. She was afraid to leave him alone, the report noted, because she didn't know how he might react. There was no record of charges being filed, no restraining order, nothing that would show up in a basic background check. But Catherine had been scared enough to call the police, and a year later, she'd filed for divorce. I found Catherine on social media, living in Denver now with a new last name and what looked like a happy life with a different husband and 2 young children. I stared at her photos for hours, her genuine smile, the relaxed way she stood next to her husband, the pictures of her rock climbing and hiking and doing all the adventurous things I used to love before Marcus convinced me they were too risky or not really us. I wanted to contact her, to ask her what had really happened, to get advice from someone who'd successfully escaped Marcus. But I was too afraid. What if Marcus was still monitoring her somehow? What if reaching out to her put both of us in danger? Instead, I kept digging. And I found out about the others. Marcus had a pattern. Not just with me, not just with Catherine, but with women throughout his life. I found evidence of at least 3 other serious relationships that had ended abruptly, badly, with the women seemingly disappearing from his social circle entirely. One of his law school classmates, a paralegal from his first firm, a woman he'd dated in between Catherine and me. The paralegal, Jessica Chen, we shared a last name before I changed mine to Morrison, which felt like some kind of sick joke now, had been fired from Marcus's firm 6 months after their relationship ended. Her LinkedIn showed a gap in employment that lasted over a year, then a series of jobs that were clearly beneath her qualifications. When I looked at her more recent posts, I could see the telltale signs of someone who'd had their confidence systematically destroyed: apologetic language, self-deprecating humor, a kind of dimmed energy that I recognized because I saw it in my own mirror every morning. I was looking at my future if I stayed. Or worse, I was looking at my present. The night I discovered Jessica's story, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't just leave Marcus. I had to destroy his ability to do this to anyone else ever again. And I realized I had advantages that Catherine and Jessica and the others hadn't had. I was still living with him. I still had access to his private spaces, his computer, his routines. And Marcus had made one crucial mistake: he'd underestimated me. He thought I was broken, defeated, too weak and dependent to fight back effectively. He was wrong. I started planning my revenge with the same methodical precision that Marcus used to plan everything else in our life. I studied his schedule, his habits, his weaknesses. I figured out how to access his computer when he wasn't around, how to photograph documents without leaving traces, how to gather the evidence I would need to not just escape him, but to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done to all of us. But I needed time, and I needed him to believe that his control over me was complete. So I became the perfect wife again. I smiled at his jokes, deferred to his opinions, stopped questioning his decisions about our finances or our social life. I made his favorite meals, scheduled our social calendar around his preferences, even started wearing the more conservative clothes he preferred. Marcus relaxed. He thought he'd won, that his Project Reconnect had successfully brought me back under his control. He became affectionate again, almost loving. He started talking about our future, maybe kids in a few years, a bigger house, a vacation home in Wisconsin where his parents had a lake house. All of it made me sick, but I played my part perfectly. Because I knew something he didn't know, I was getting ready to destroy him. The hardest part about planning to destroy your husband's life is pretending to be happy while you do it. For 6 weeks, I perfected the art of being the wife Marcus wanted while systematically gathering everything I'd need to bring him down. Every morning, I made his coffee exactly how he liked it: 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in the blue ceramic mug his mother had given us for our wedding. Every evening, I asked about his day and listened to his answers like they were fascinating. Every night, I let him touch me and pretended it didn't make my skin crawl. But during the day, while he was at work and thought I was safely contained in my predictable routine, I was building a case against him that would destroy not just our marriage, but his entire carefully constructed life. My breakthrough came when I found his insurance policy. Marcus kept a home office that was supposedly off-limits to me, though he'd never explicitly said so. It was just understood: his desk, his files, his private space where he handled important business. But I'd noticed that he always locked the door when he left for work, and that the key disappeared into his suit jacket pocket every morning. It took me 3 days to figure out his system. Marcus was a creature of habit, and like most people who think they're smarter than everyone else, his habits were predictable once you studied them. Every morning, he'd shower first while I made breakfast. He'd come downstairs in his robe, eat while checking emails on his phone, then go back upstairs to get dressed. The key to his office stayed in his pants pocket from the previous day, hanging in our walk-in closet. The first time I used it, my hands shook so badly I could barely turn the lock. But once I was inside Marcus's private domain, I understood that I'd found the center of his web. His desk drawers were meticulously organized, labeled with that precise handwriting I'd once found charming. Insurance, investments, personal, legal. But it was the filing cabinet in the corner that held the real treasures, or horrors, depending on how you looked at it. Marcus kept files on people. Not just financial records or legal documents, but actual files on individuals. His ex-wife Catherine had a folder 3 inches thick, filled with printed emails, photos, credit reports, and what looked like a private investigator surveillance notes dating back to 2013, a full year after their divorce was finalized. He'd been watching her, tracking her, keeping tabs on her new life. Jessica Chen, the paralegal, had a similar file. Phone records, employment history, copies of her social media posts, even medical records that I couldn't figure out how he'd obtained. There were files on his current co-workers, including partners at his firm. Files on neighbors, including photos taken from our windows and notes about their schedules and habits. And then I found my file. Seeing your own life reduced to surveillance notes and strategic planning documents is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Marcus had been documenting my concerning behaviors for over a year. Every lunch with a coworker, every phone call that lasted longer than 10 minutes, every time I came home late from work or seemed distant during dinner. He'd screenshot my text messages, tracked my location through our shared cell phone plan, even made notes about my menstrual cycle and how it affected my emotional stability. But the most chilling document was titled Sarah Intervention Strategy. It was a step-by-step plan for what he called correcting my destructive patterns. Phase 1. Limit outside influences, isolate me from friends and family. Phase 2. Redirect focus to marriage priorities, sabotage my career advancement. Phase 3. Establish financial dependency, exactly what he'd done with our accounts. Phase 4. Seek professional intervention, force me into couples counseling with a therapist of his choosing. There was a Phase 5, but that section was locked in a separate folder that required a password I didn't have yet. At the bottom of my file was a life insurance policy I'd never seen before. Marcus had taken out $1 million policy on my life 6 months ago, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The policy was comprehensive, covering accidental death, natural causes, even suicide after a 2-year waiting period. I sat in his leather desk chair, staring at that insurance policy, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't fear anymore, it was clarity. Marcus wasn't just controlling me or emotionally abusing me. He was planning something. Maybe not my death, not yet, but something that would remove me from his life while allowing him to benefit financially from my absence. That night, I almost confronted him. I wanted to throw the insurance policy on the dinner table and demand explanations. But I'd learned too much about Marcus to make that mistake. Confronting him would only make him more careful, more dangerous. Instead, I needed to be smarter than he was. I started photographing everything in his files, using my phone to capture pages of documentation that I uploaded to a secure cloud account he couldn't access. I made copies of the insurance policy, the surveillance notes, the intervention strategy, all of it. But I also started digging into what he was doing at work, because those files on his co-workers suggested he was playing games that extended far beyond our marriage. Marcus worked late most Tuesday and Thursday evenings, or at least that's what he told me. But when I checked his location through our shared phone plan, he wasn't at his office building. He was at various restaurants and hotels around Chicago, always in different locations, always for exactly 2 hours. I started following him. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand. Marcus had taught me that surveillance was normal, that monitoring someone you love was just being thorough. And I needed to know what he was doing during those mysterious evenings, especially since they often coincided with large cash withdrawals from our accounts that he explained away as client entertainment expenses. The first night I followed him, he went to the Palmer House Hotel and met with a woman I didn't recognize. She was about my age, professionally dressed, and they sat in the lobby bar talking quietly for exactly 90 minutes before she left alone. Marcus stayed for another 30 minutes, making phone calls and taking notes. The second time, different woman, different hotel, same pattern. By the fourth time I followed him, I understood what I was witnessing. Marcus was interviewing potential wives. That sounds insane, but the evidence was overwhelming. These women all fit a specific profile: educated, professionally successful, in their late 20s or early 30s, financially stable but not wealthy enough to be completely independent. Marcus would spend weeks researching them through social media and public records before arranging these chance meetings that were actually carefully orchestrated interviews. I found his process documented in his computer files when I finally cracked his password system. Marcus used a combination of his mother's maiden name and the year he graduated law school, not exactly NSA-level security, but then again, he never expected his wife to be investigating him. He had detailed profiles on 7 different women, complete with financial records, psychological assessments based on their social media posts, and compatibility rankings. He was shopping for my replacement while still married to me, planning his next relationship while systematically destroying my ability to leave the current one. The most terrifying part was how good he was at it. Marcus had perfected a system for finding emotionally vulnerable, financially dependent women and positioning himself as their salvation. He'd identify women going through divorces, career transitions, or family crises, then engineer situations where he could sweep in as the supportive, stable, successful man they needed. I recognized the pattern because it's exactly what he'd done with me. When we met, I was stressed about graduate school, overwhelmed by my parents' expectations, dealing with my grandmother's death. Marcus had appeared like a knight in shining armor, offering stability and support and a vision of a future where I wouldn't have to struggle anymore. But here's what I discovered that changed everything. Marcus wasn't just planning to replace me. He was planning to collect on my life insurance policy first. Hidden in his encrypted files, and yes, I'd figured out how to access those too, because underestimating your opponent is always a mistake. I found what he called his exit strategy. It wasn't just about divorcing me and moving on to the next victim. It was about making sure I couldn't expose his pattern, couldn't warn the other women, couldn't damage his reputation or his financial plans. The exit strategy had multiple phases, depending on how cooperative I was during the dissolution of our marriage. The preferred option was what he termed natural deterioration, essentially driving me to suicide through systematic emotional abuse, isolation, and psychological manipulation. The insurance policy would pay out, he'd be the grieving widower, and his next relationship would begin with both sympathy and financial security. If the natural deterioration approach failed, there were alternatives. Options that involved accidents, medical emergencies, situations where a grieving husband's testimony about his wife's declining mental health would be the primary evidence. I sat in his office at 2 a.m, reading my husband's plans to kill me, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, crystalline rage. Marcus thought I was weak, broken, too damaged and dependent to fight back. He'd spent years conditioning me to believe that I was lucky to have him, that I couldn't survive without him, that leaving would mean losing everything that mattered. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. But I couldn't just go to the police. Marcus was a respected attorney with connections throughout the legal system. His files were sophisticated enough to look like legitimate research, and his insurance policy was perfectly legal. Without proof of an actual attempt on my life, any accusations I made would sound like the paranoid delusions of an unstable wife, exactly the narrative he'd been building about me for months. I needed him to actually try to kill me, and I needed to be ready when he did. The next morning, I started phase 1 of my own strategy, convincing Marcus that his natural deterioration approach was working perfectly. I became increasingly anxious, increasingly dependent, increasingly isolated. I quit going to the gym, stopped wearing makeup most days, started having panic attacks at social gatherings that required Marcus to take me home early. I began leaving windows open and forgetting to lock doors, small signs of what looked like declining mental stability. I started making mistakes at work, nothing that would get me fired, but enough to create a paper trail of deteriorating job performance. To the outside world, I looked like a woman having a breakdown. To Marcus, I looked like a woman who was almost ready to eliminate herself from his life permanently. But while I was performing the role of the deteriorating wife, I was also preparing for war. I documented everything: his files, his surveillance, his meeting with potential replacements, his exit strategy. I copied it all to multiple secure locations and sent sealed copies to lawyers in different states with instructions for what to do if something happened to me. I also began my own surveillance operation. If Marcus thought he was the only one who could play detective, he was about to get a very rude awakening. I hired a private investigator, not someone in Chicago where Marcus had connections, but a woman in Milwaukee who specialized in domestic cases. Patricia Reeves was a former police detective who understood exactly what I was dealing with and why I couldn't go through official channels. She started building a parallel case file, documenting Marcus's pattern of behavior, his history with other women, his current activities. Patricia also helped me understand something crucial. I wasn't Marcus's first wife to discover his true nature. Catherine, his ex-wife, had tried to warn authorities before their divorce. She'd given police a detailed statement about his controlling behavior, his surveillance, his threats. But without physical evidence or witnesses, her claims had been dismissed as vindictive accusations from a bitter divorce. Patricia had tracked down 2 of Marcus's other ex-girlfriends. Both had similar stories: charming courtship, gradual control, systematic isolation, then sudden, vicious retaliation when they tried to leave. One had been blacklisted from her industry after Marcus spread rumors about her instability. Another had been forced to move across the country after what she described as a campaign of harassment and intimidation. Marcus had perfected his system over years of practice. But he'd never encountered a victim who was willing to play his game better than he could. That's when I decided exactly how I was going to destroy him. The plan I developed over the following weeks was elegant in its simplicity. I was going to let Marcus try to kill me, and then I was going to turn his own methods against him. But first, I had to make him believe that the moment was right, that I was vulnerable enough and isolated enough for his exit strategy to work. November in Chicago is perfect for someone planning to look like they're having a mental breakdown. The days are short, the weather is gray and bitter, and everyone expects people to seem a little more depressed than usual. I used the season to my advantage, gradually becoming more withdrawn, more erratic, more convincingly unstable. I started leaving work early, claiming headaches and anxiety attacks. I cancelled plans with a few couple friends we still saw, always with apologetic excuses about not feeling well. I began taking long walks alone in the evenings, sometimes not coming home until after dark, which gave Marcus opportunities to document my concerning behavior while also establishing a pattern that would make a future accident seem more plausible. But the masterstroke was the therapy appointments. Remember how Marcus had arranged for me to stop seeing Dr. Martinez and start couples counseling instead? I'd been going to those sessions for 2 months, sitting in Dr. Gerald Hoffman's office twice a week while Marcus explained my deteriorating mental state to a therapist who clearly viewed me as the unstable half of our marriage. Dr. Hoffman was exactly the kind of therapist Marcus would choose, an older man, traditional in his views about marriage and gender roles, easily manipulated by Marcus's lawyer charm and professional credentials. During our sessions, Marcus would express his deep concern about my anxiety, my paranoid thoughts about our finances, my increasing isolation from friends and family. "I'm worried she's having some kind of breakdown," Marcus would say, his voice heavy with false concern. "She's been making wild accusations, talking about wanting to leave our marriage, even mentioning suicide sometimes. I don't know how to help her. I played my part perfectly. I sat quietly while Marcus described symptoms I didn't have and behaviors that were carefully calculated performances. When Dr. Hoffman asked me direct questions, I gave vague, evasive answers that made me sound confused and possibly delusional. Sarah, your husband is concerned that you've been having thoughts of self-harm. Is that something you'd like to talk about? Sometimes I just feel like everyone would be better off without me, I'd say, staring at my hands. Like I'm just a burden on everyone, especially Marcus. He'd probably be happier if I just wasn't around anymore. Marcus would reach over and squeeze my hand, the picture of a devoted husband trying to save his troubled wife. Dr. Hoffman would make notes about my depressive ideation and my husband's admirable commitment to our marriage. What neither of them knew was that I was recording every session. Illinois is a two-party consent state for recordings, which means secretly recording someone is generally illegal. But there are exceptions for gathering evidence of crimes, and I was betting that Marcus's plan to kill me qualified. I had a small digital recorder sewn into the lining of my purse, and every word of those therapy sessions was being preserved for future use. I was building a comprehensive record of Marcus's manipulation, his lies about my mental state, and his systematic construction of a narrative that would make my eventual death look like suicide. When the time came, I would have proof of his premeditation, his method, and his motive. But I needed more than just recorded therapy sessions. I needed Marcus to reveal his true intentions, preferably in a way that would be undeniably criminal. That's where the soup comes in. Marcus had been researching methods, and I knew this because I'd been monitoring his computer activity through spyware that Patricia had helped me install. His browser history revealed searches for untraceable poisons, methods of inducing heart attacks, ways to make murder look like natural death. He'd been particularly interested in something called aconitine, a poison derived from monkshood plants that could cause cardiac arrest and was difficult to detect in standard autopsies. Marcus thought he was being clever by using public computers at libraries and internet cafes for his research. What he didn't know was that Patricia had been tracking his movements and documenting his visits to those locations. We had photographs of him at 3 different libraries, timestamps that correlated with poison-related searches, even video footage from one location where he'd forgotten to position himself outside the security camera's range. The beauty of aconitine, from Marcus's perspective, was that it occurred naturally in plants that grew wild in Illinois. If trace amounts were found in my system after my death, it could be explained as accidental poisoning from foraging or gardening mishaps. Combined with my documented mental health struggles and my husband's testimony about my deteriorating state, it would be the perfect murder disguised as either suicide or tragic accident. Marcus had been setting up his opportunity for weeks, carefully establishing routines that would give him access to my food and drink. He'd started insisting on cooking dinner more often, making my morning coffee, even preparing my lunch for work. The devoted husband, taking care of his struggling wife. But I knew exactly when he was going to make his move. December 15th, a Tuesday evening when we had no social obligations and no one expected to hear from us until the next day. I knew because I'd seen his calendar, cross-referenced it with his recent purchases from a botanical supply company, and confirmed it through his increasingly anxious behavior as the date approached. The Monday before, I made my final preparations. I sent sealed envelopes to Patricia, to the lawyer I'd retained in Milwaukee, and to a journalist I'd researched who specialized in crime stories involving domestic abuse. The envelopes contained copies of all my evidence, detailed explanations of Marcus's pattern of behavior, and instructions for what to do if I died or disappeared. I also made a video recording, stored in multiple secure locations, explaining everything I'd discovered and predicting exactly how Marcus would try to kill me. If his plan succeeded, if I miscalculated somehow, at least there would be evidence of what had really happened. But I wasn't planning to die. I was planning to let Marcus reveal himself completely, and then I was going to destroy him. Tuesday morning, December 15th. Marcus was unusually attentive. He made my coffee with extra care, kissed me goodbye with what seemed like genuine affection, even complimented me on a sweater I was wearing, something he hadn't done in months. "You look beautiful today," he said, straightening my collar with gentle fingers. "I love you so much, Sarah. I want you to know that, no matter what happens." No matter what happens. If I hadn't known what was coming, those words might have seemed romantic. Instead, they sounded like a confession. I went to work as usual, but left early, claiming another headache. I wanted to be home before Marcus, wanted to observe his final preparations. I parked a few blocks away and entered through our back door, moving quietly through the house to my observation post in the upstairs hallway. Marcus came home at exactly 5:30, which was unusual. He typically worked until at least 7 on Tuesdays. He went straight to his office, emerging 10 minutes later with something small clasped in his hand. He looked around carefully, checking to make sure I wasn't home yet, then went to the kitchen. I watched from the top of the stairs as my husband prepared to murder me. He moved with practiced efficiency, like he'd rehearsed these motions. He took out ingredients for his famous mushroom soup, a recipe his mother had taught him, one of the few dishes he knew how to make well. But this time, he added a special ingredient. The aconitine came in a small vial that he handled with surgical gloves. Just a few drops in the pot, stirred carefully to distribute evenly. Enough to cause cardiac arrest within 30 minutes of consumption, not enough to be easily detected unless someone was specifically looking for plant-based toxins. Marcus cleaned up meticulously, disposing of the vial and gloves in a garbage bag that he immediately took to the outdoor bin. He washed his hands 3 times, scrubbing under his fingernails and up his forearms like he was preparing for surgery. Then he called out, "Sarah? Are you home? Honey? I'm making soup for dinner." This was the moment. Everything I'd planned, everything I'd prepared for, came down to the next 30 minutes. I waited until I heard Marcus step out onto the back deck to check something in the garage, part of his usual routine when he was cooking. Then I moved. I had exactly 90 seconds while Marcus was in the garage. I timed his routine obsessively over the past week. 90 seconds to execute the most crucial part of my plan and set the trap that would finally expose him for what he really was. The kitchen smelled like mushrooms and herbs, deceptively homey and normal. 2 bowls sat on our kitchen island, both filled with Marcus's soup, both looking identical. But only one contained enough poison to kill me within the hour. Here's what Marcus didn't know. I'd been watching him for weeks. I knew his patterns, his habits, his obsessive need for control over every detail. Marcus always served soup in the same 2 bowls, white ceramic ones with blue trim that had been a wedding gift from his aunt. And Marcus always gave me the bowl from the right side of our counter because he was left-handed and it was the natural way he reached for things. I'd been counting on that predictability. Moving quickly but carefully, I switched the bowls. The one that had been on the right side of the counter, my bowl, the poisoned one, went to the left side. The clean bowl moved to the right. It was such a simple swap, something that would look completely natural if anyone happened to see it. Just a wife helping to set the table for dinner. But I didn't just switch the bowls. I also activated the recording equipment I'd hidden throughout our kitchen and dining room over the past month. Tiny cameras disguised as decorative objects, audio recorders built into picture frames, even a device in the light fixture above our table that would capture everything that happened in the next hour. Marcus was about to confess to attempted murder, and I was going to have it all documented. I heard his footsteps on the back deck and quickly moved to the bottom of the stairs, calling out like I'd just gotten home. "Marcus, something smells amazing." "Perfect timing," he called back, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. He was happy because he thought his plan was working flawlessly. "I made your favorite soup. Come eat while it's hot." I walked into the kitchen with the same tired, defeated posture I'd been perfecting for months. Marcus was already seated at our small dining table, his bowl in front of him, the bowl that now contained enough aconitine to kill him. My bowl, the clean one, sat at my usual place. "You made mushroom soup," I said, sitting down and picking up my spoon. "That's so sweet of you." Marcus watched me intently as I took my first spoonful. His eyes were bright, alert, studying my face for any signs that I could taste something wrong with the soup. When I showed no reaction, when I continued eating normally, he relaxed and smiled. "I thought you could use some comfort food," he said. "You've seemed so stressed lately." This was it. This was the moment when everything would change, when all of Marcus's careful planning would collapse around him. I continued eating my soup slowly, making conversation about my day, playing the role of the unsuspecting wife for the hidden cameras. Work was better today, I said. I think I'm starting to feel a little more like myself again. That's wonderful, honey. Marcus took a large spoonful of his own soup. I've been so worried about you. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I finished my bowl and complimented him on the recipe, suggested he should cook more often. Marcus was eating more slowly now, checking his watch, probably wondering why I wasn't showing any symptoms yet. The poison should have started affecting me within 15 minutes. 15 minutes became 20. 20 became 25. That's when Marcus started to sweat. At first, he tried to hide it. He loosened his tie, complained about the house being too warm, got up to adjust the thermostat. But I could see the confusion in his eyes, the growing panic as he realized something was wrong. Are you feeling okay? I asked innocently. You look a little pale. I'm fine, he said, but his voice was strained. He sat back down and tried to finish his soup, but his hand was shaking now. Just tired. 28 minutes after we'd started eating, Marcus clutched his chest and dropped his spoon. Sarah, he gasped. Something's wrong. I think I'm having a heart attack. I stood up slowly, calmly, and looked down at my husband as he struggled to breathe. His face was flushed, then pale, then flushed again. His hands were trembling, and I could see the terror in his eyes as he realized what was happening to him. Oh my God, Marcus, I said, pulling out my phone. I'm calling 911. But instead of dialing 911, I activated the recording app I'd prepared for this moment. Everything that happened next would be preserved forever. Wait, Marcus managed to say. Wait, don't call yet. I knelt down beside his chair, my voice full of concern. Marcus, you need medical attention. You're having some kind of cardiac episode. That's when he broke. The soup, he whispered. There was something in the soup. What do you mean? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. I put something in your soup. Poison. But somehow. He was struggling to speak now, the aconitine affecting his nervous system. Somehow I got the wrong bowl. There it was. The confession I needed, recorded in high-definition audio and video from multiple angles. Marcus admitting to attempted murder, explaining his method, all while suffering from the effects of his own poison. You tried to poison me, I said, letting shock and hurt color my voice for the cameras. Marcus, why would you do that? The insurance, he gasped. I needed the money. And you were going to leave anyway. This way was better. Cleaner. Better. Cleaner. He was talking about my death like it was a business transaction he was trying to optimize. I don't understand, I said. What insurance? Marcus was doubled over now, clutching his stomach, fighting the effects of the aconitine. But he couldn't stop talking. The poison was affecting his judgment along with his body, making him desperate to confess, to explain, to somehow make sense of what was happening to him. Life insurance policy, he managed. $1 million. I've been planning this for months. Had to make it look like suicide, like you finally gave up. You've been planning to kill me for months. Not just you. The words were coming out in a rush now, like he couldn't control them. Catherine too, but she left before I could, and Jessica, but she moved away. You were supposed to be different. You were supposed to stay, supposed to make this easy. Catherine. Jessica. He was confessing not just to trying to kill me, but to planning to kill other women. The cameras were recording everything, his methods, his motives, his complete lack of remorse. Marcus, I'm calling for help, I said, but he grabbed my wrist. No, he said. Let me die. Let me just. It's better this way. For both of us. That's when I made a decision that I've questioned every day since. I could have called 911 immediately. The aconitine dose Marcus had prepared was calculated to kill someone my size, about 125 pounds, but Marcus weighed almost 200 pounds. With immediate medical intervention, he probably would have survived. Instead, I sat beside him and watched him die. Not because I wanted revenge, though I did. Not because I thought he deserved it, though he did. But because I knew that if Marcus survived, if he recovered and faced trial, his connections in the legal system would find ways to minimize his crimes. He'd claim temporary insanity, or frame it as a crime of passion, or somehow make himself the victim of his own actions. But if he died, if his confession was the last act of his life, there could be no spin, no legal maneuvering, no second chances. His voice on those recordings would be the final word on who Marcus Morrison really was. I held his hand while he died. Not out of love or forgiveness, but because I wanted him to understand, in his final moments, that I had beaten him. That the weak, broken woman he thought he'd married had been strong enough to turn his own weapon against him. I know about all of them, I whispered as his breathing became shallow. Catherine, Jessica, all the others. And now everyone else will know too. Marcus tried to say something else, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes were wide with terror and understanding as he realized that he hadn't just failed to kill me, he'd handed me everything I needed to destroy his reputation, expose his crimes, and make sure no other woman would ever fall victim to his manipulations. He died at 7:23 p.m., exactly 47 minutes after taking his first spoonful of poisoned soup. I sat with his body for another 10 minutes, making sure he was really gone, making sure the cameras had captured everything. Then I called 911. 911. What's your emergency? My husband, I said, letting my voice break with shock and grief. I think my husband is dead. The next 4 hours were the most carefully orchestrated performance of my life. Everything depended on my ability to play the shocked, grieving widow while the police, paramedics, and investigators swarmed through our house. One wrong word, one inconsistent detail, and my entire plan would collapse. The first responders arrived within 6 minutes of my call. I met them at the front door, tears streaming down my face, hands shaking as I pointed toward the dining room where Marcus's body still sat slumped in his chair. He just collapsed, I told the paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes who immediately began checking for vital signs. We were having dinner, and he started clutching his chest, said he couldn't breathe. I thought it was a heart attack. The paramedic worked efficiently, but I could see in her face that it was too late. Marcus had been dead for over 10 minutes by the time they arrived. Behind her, 2 police officers were surveying the scene, taking notes, asking me preliminary questions. Mrs. Morrison, I'm Officer Janet Rodriguez, the older of the 2 officers said gently. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few questions about what happened tonight. I nodded, wiping my eyes with a tissue. Of course. Whatever you need. Can you walk me through the evening? What time did you get home? What did you and your husband do? I gave them a carefully edited version of the truth. I'd come home around 6, found Marcus cooking dinner. We'd sat down to eat around 7. He'd seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but normal. Then suddenly he'd grabbed his chest, said he felt like he was having a heart attack, and collapsed. Did your husband have any history of heart problems? Officer Rodriguez asked. Not that I knew of, I said. But he'd been under a lot of stress at work lately. Long hours, difficult cases. And he hadn't been eating well, hadn't been exercising. All of this was true, documented in the therapy sessions that would soon become part of the investigation. The paramedics had pronounced Marcus dead at the scene, which meant the coroner would have to be called, which meant there would be an autopsy, which meant the aconitine would eventually be discovered. I was counting on all of this. Detective Michael Harrison arrived about an hour later. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much of humanity's worst impulses. He introduced himself politely, expressed his condolences, then asked if he could speak with me privately. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand that any sudden death requires investigation, he said as we sat in our living room. It's nothing personal. just procedure. Can you tell me about your husband's state of mind lately? Any changes in behavior, mood, anything unusual? This was the opening I'd been waiting for. Actually, yes, I said, fresh tears starting to flow. Marcus had been different lately. Paranoid, I guess. He thought I was having an affair, thought I was planning to leave him. We'd been in couples counseling because of it. Detective Harrison made notes. How long had this been going on? Months. Maybe longer. He'd been going through my things, checking my phone, following me sometimes. He was convinced I was plotting against him somehow. Every word was true, just not in the way it sounded. And how did you feel about his behavior? Scared, I said honestly. Confused. The man I married wasn't paranoid or controlling. This was like living with a stranger. Dr. Hoffman, our therapist, said Marcus was showing signs of severe anxiety, maybe even some kind of personality disorder. I gave Detective Harrison Dr. Hoffman's contact information, knowing that the therapist would corroborate my story about Marcus's deteriorating mental state and his paranoid accusations about my behavior. The recorded sessions would paint a picture of a man spiraling into delusion and desperation. The crime scene investigators worked through the night, photographing everything, collecting samples, documenting the scene. They took the soup bowls, the remaining soup in the pot, samples from the garbage disposal. They would find traces of aconitine in Marcus's bowl, in his body, in the cooking pot. They would also find my hidden cameras. I'd positioned them carefully, knowing they would be discovered during a thorough investigation. The cameras would show me switching the bowls, but the audio wouldn't pick up my movements. I'd been careful to stay out of range of the microphones during those crucial 90 seconds. Instead, the cameras would capture Marcus's confession. His admission that he'd poisoned my soup, that he'd been planning my death for months, that he'd considered killing other women. They would show me trying to help him, offering to call for medical assistance, begging him to explain what was happening. The cameras would tell the story I wanted them to tell. Marcus Morrison had tried to murder his wife, accidentally poisoned himself instead, and confessed to his crimes while dying from his own weapon. Detective Harrison found the first camera around 2 a.m., hidden inside a decorative vase on our mantel. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, holding up the small device. "Can you explain this?" I looked at the camera with apparent confusion, then sudden understanding. Oh my God. Marcus has been recording me. What do you mean? The paranoia I told you about? He thought I was cheating, thought I was planning to leave him. He must have set up cameras to watch me when he wasn't home. I covered my face with my hands. I can't believe he was spying on me in my own house. Detective Harrison found 3 more cameras over the next hour, all positioned to capture activity in our main living spaces. When he asked about accessing the recordings, I told him I had no idea how Marcus's surveillance system worked, but that he was welcome to take whatever equipment he needed. What the detective would find, when he reviewed those recordings, was hours of footage showing a controlling husband monitoring his wife's every movement, and one crucial recording of Marcus confessing to attempted murder before dying from his own poison. By morning, the initial autopsy results confirmed what everyone already suspected. Marcus Morrison had died from aconitine poisoning. The question was whether it had been suicide, accident, or murder. I spent the next 3 days being interviewed by police, by prosecutors, by insurance investigators. I told the same story consistently. My husband had been paranoid and unstable, convinced I was betraying him somehow. He'd been seeing a therapist, researching my behavior obsessively, setting up cameras to spy on me. The evidence supported everything I said. Marcus's computer showed extensive research into poisons, surveillance methods, and ways to make murder look like suicide. His files contained detailed plans for killing me and collecting on my life insurance policy. The therapy recordings revealed his deteriorating mental state and his obsession with my supposed infidelity. But the most damning evidence was his own voice, captured on his hidden cameras, confessing to attempted murder. "The soup," Marcus's recorded voice said clearly. "I put something in your soup. Poison." The prosecutor, District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, called it the strangest case she'd seen in 20 years of practice. Marcus Morrison planned the perfect murder, she told reporters at a press conference. But in his paranoid, obsessive state, he apparently became confused about which bowl contained the poison. His own surveillance equipment recorded his confession to attempted murder before he died from the very weapon he'd intended to use on his wife. Case closed. Marcus Morrison had died by his own hand, a victim of his own meticulous planning and deteriorating mental state. I was the grieving widow, the intended victim who'd survived only through her husband's fatal error. The insurance company paid out Marcus's life insurance policy within 2 weeks. $1 million, tax-free, for the accidental death of my husband. But I wasn't done yet. 3 weeks after Marcus's funeral, I did something that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. I threw a party. Not a celebration of his death. I wasn't a monster, despite what I'd done, but a gathering of everyone who'd known Marcus, everyone who'd been touched by his manipulations, everyone who deserved to know the truth about who he really was. I invited Catherine Walsh, his ex-wife, who drove down from Milwaukee with her new husband. I invited Jessica Chen, the paralegal whose career he'd destroyed. I invited the other women from his files, the ones he'd dated and discarded and threatened. I invited his colleagues from the law firm, his neighbors, even Dr. Hoffman, the therapist who'd been unwittingly complicit in Marcus's plans. The party was ostensibly a memorial service, a chance for Marcus's friends and family to share memories and find closure. But what it really was a revelation. I'd spent the week since his death preparing for this moment, gathering every piece of evidence Marcus had collected, every document he'd hidden, every secret he'd thought was safely buried. I'd compiled it all into a comprehensive presentation that would strip away the facade he'd maintained for so long. "Thank you all for coming," I said, standing in our living room surrounded by 40 people who thought they were there to honor Marcus's memory. I know Marcus would be touched to see so many people here who cared about him. The presentation started innocuously enough. Photos of Marcus through the years, stories about his professional achievements, testimonials from colleagues about his dedication to his work. Standard memorial service material that painted him as a successful attorney, a devoted husband, a pillar of the community. But then I began to reveal the truth. "Many of you knew Marcus as a charming, successful man," I said, clicking to the next slide of my presentation. "But I think it's important that we all understand who he really was, especially for those of you who might be dealing with similar situations in your own lives." The first revelation was his surveillance operation. I showed his files on neighbors, colleagues, and casual acquaintances. Photos he'd taken without permission, personal information he'd gathered through illegal means, detailed notes about people's private lives and vulnerabilities. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins from next door gasped when she saw the file Marcus had kept on her, complete with photos of her backyard taken from our upstairs windows and notes about her daily routines. "He knew when I left for my book club," she whispered. "He knew about my doctor's appointments." But the real shock came when I revealed Marcus's relationship history. "Catherine," I said, turning to his ex-wife, who was sitting pale and tense on our couch, "I think everyone should know why your marriage to Marcus really ended." I displayed the police report from 2011, the one documenting Catherine's fears about Marcus's increasingly controlling behavior. I showed his post-divorce surveillance of her, the files he'd kept tracking her movements for years after their separation, the evidence that he'd never really let her go. Catherine started crying, not tears of grief, but tears of relief that someone finally believed her, that someone finally understood what she'd lived through. "Jessica," I continued, turning to the paralegal who'd been fired after dating Marcus, "your career didn't end because of performance issues." I showed Marcus's files on Jessica, his detailed plans for destroying her professional reputation, the connections he'd used to blacklist her from firms throughout Chicago. Jessica had spent 3 years thinking she'd failed as a lawyer, that she wasn't good enough, that her career collapse had been her own fault. Now she understood that it had been a deliberate campaign of professional destruction. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "And now I want to share something that Marcus himself recorded, just before he died," I said, playing the audio from that final dinner. "I think it's important that you all understand what kind of man we're really here to remember." Marcus's voice filled the room, confessing to attempted murder, explaining his methods, admitting his plans to kill not just me but other women who tried to leave him. The room was silent except for his recorded words, his casual discussion of poison and insurance money and making murder look like suicide. When the recording ended, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then Dr. Hoffman, the therapist, spoke up. "I need to call the police," he said. "If Marcus was planning to harm other women, if there are ongoing threats." "There are no ongoing threats," I said calmly. "Marcus is dead. But I thought you all deserved to know the truth about who he was, especially those of you who might have blamed yourselves for how your relationships with him ended." One by one, other people began to speak. A woman from his law firm talked about how Marcus had sabotaged her cases when she'd rejected his advances. A neighbor described feeling watched and followed whenever he was around. Even Marcus's own brother admitted that he'd always felt uneasy about Marcus's relationships, the way his girlfriends and wives seemed to disappear from his life so completely. "I thought Catherine had just moved on," his brother David said, looking ashamed. "I thought Jessica had found a better job. I never realized he was driving them away deliberately, systematically destroying their lives when they tried to leave." The memorial service became something unprecedented, a group therapy session for Marcus's victims, a chance for everyone he'd manipulated to finally understand that they weren't alone, that they weren't crazy, that they weren't responsible for what had happened to them. But I wasn't finished. The biggest revelation was still to come. "There's one more thing," I said as the evening was winding down. "Something I discovered about Marcus that explains everything, his need for control, his pattern of relationships, his escalating behavior." I clicked to the final slide of my presentation, a document I'd found buried deep in Marcus's encrypted files. It was a psychological evaluation from 2015, conducted by a private psychiatrist whose name Marcus had never mentioned to me. Dr. Sarah Kim had diagnosed Marcus with what she termed malignant narcissism with psychopathic tendencies. Her report detailed his complete lack of empathy, his view of other people as objects to be manipulated, his escalating need for control and domination in his relationships. "The patient shows classic signs of antisocial personality disorder," Dr. Kim had written. "He views relationships as games to be won rather than connections to be nurtured. He derives satisfaction from psychological manipulation and shows no genuine remorse for the harm he causes others." The evaluation had been commissioned by Marcus himself, apparently as research for a legal case he was working on. But reading Dr. Kim's assessment, it was clear that Marcus had recognized himself in the clinical descriptions and had used the evaluation as a roadmap for his behavior rather than a warning about his problems. "He knew what he was," I told the room. "He knew he was a predator, knew he was dangerous, and he chose to embrace it rather than seek help." When I finished speaking, Catherine Walsh came up to me with tears in her eyes. "Why didn't you just leave him?" she asked. "Why did you stay and fight? You could have just disappeared like I did." It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the past months. Why had I chosen to destroy Marcus rather than simply escape him? "Because he would have found someone else," I said. "He was already interviewing replacements for me, already planning his next relationship. If I'd just left, he would have moved on to the next victim, and she might not have been as lucky as I was." "Lucky?" Catherine looked at me like I was insane. "You call what happened to you lucky?" "I call it justice," I said. "Marcus spent years thinking he was smarter than everyone else, that he could manipulate and control people without consequences. He thought his victims were weak, that we deserved what he did to us. He was wrong." The party, memorial service, whatever you want to call it, ended around midnight. People left with a mixture of closure and horror, finally understanding the truth about Marcus Morrison but struggling to process the fact that they'd all been living in proximity to such calculated evil. Jessica Chen was the last to leave. She stood at my front door, keys in hand, looking back at the house where Marcus had planned so many people's destruction. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do you think it's really over?" "For us, yes," I said. "But there might be others. Women he dated before Catherine, victims we haven't found yet. That's why I documented everything, why I made sure his confession was recorded. If other women come forward, if there are other cases, there's evidence now." Jessica nodded, then surprised me by giving me a hug. "Thank you," she said. For the first time in 3 years, I don't feel like I'm crazy. I don't feel like I imagined what happened to me. After everyone left, I sat in my empty house, my house now, not ours, and reflected on what I'd accomplished. Marcus was dead, his victims knew the truth, and his pattern of abuse had been permanently ended. Justice, in a way that the legal system never could have provided. But there was one final piece of business to handle. The next morning, I called Detective Harrison and told him I'd found something else in Marcus's files that he should see. When he arrived, I handed him a flash drive containing copies of everything: Marcus's surveillance files, his research into poisons, his plans for killing me, and most importantly, his files on other women. Some of these cases might still be within the statute of limitations, I told him. Financial fraud, stalking, harassment. Marcus is dead, but there might be accomplices, people who helped him gather information or carry out his plans. Detective Harrison looked through the files with growing amazement and disgust. Mrs. Morrison, this is one of the most comprehensive criminal enterprises I've ever seen. How long was your husband doing this? At least 10 years, maybe longer. And detective? There might be other victims, women who never reported what happened to them because they thought no one would believe them. You might want to put out a public call for information. Within a week, Detective Harrison's tip line had received over 30 calls from women who'd had relationships or encounters with Marcus Morrison. Most of the incidents were beyond the statute of limitations, but several cases were still prosecutable. More importantly, the investigation revealed a network of private investigators, corrupt clerks, and unethical lawyers who'd helped Marcus gather information on his targets. By spring, 6 people had been arrested on charges ranging from identity theft to conspiracy to commit stalking. Marcus's law firm was under investigation, and several cases he'd worked on were being reviewed for prosecutorial misconduct. The ripple effects of his death were still spreading, still revealing the full scope of his criminal activities. But for me, personally, it was finally over. I sold the house in Cedar Ridge and moved to Portland, Oregon, where I'd been accepted into a PhD program in psychology. I wanted to understand how people like Marcus operated, how they chose their victims, how they maintained their facades for so long without being detected. More importantly, I wanted to help other women recognize the signs before it was too late. If you've made it this far in my story, if you're still listening, I want you to know something. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm not proud that I let my husband die when I could have saved him. But I'm not sorry either. Marcus Morrison was a predator who destroyed lives for his own entertainment. He would have kept doing it until someone stopped him permanently. The legal system failed Catherine, failed Jessica, failed all his other victims. So I did what the system couldn't do. I ended him. 2 years have passed since that December evening when I watched my husband die from his own poison, and I'm finally ready to tell you how this story really ends. Not with revenge or justice or dramatic courtroom scenes, but with something quieter and perhaps more important: healing. I'm writing this from my apartment in Portland, overlooking the Willamette River, in between classes at Portland State University where I'm finishing my PhD in clinical psychology. My dissertation is on recognizing and treating victims of covert psychological abuse, research that's drawn from very personal experience, though my academic advisors don't know that part of the story. If you're watching this video from somewhere in the world where you're questioning your own relationship, where someone is making you feel crazy or small or trapped, please listen to what I'm about to tell you. Because the most important lesson I learned isn't about revenge or getting even with someone who hurt you. It's about recognizing your own worth before someone convinces you that you don't have any. The first year after Marcus's death was harder than I expected. Not because I missed him, I didn't, but because I had to learn how to be myself again. I hadn't realized how completely I'd disappeared into his vision of who I should be until I was suddenly free to make my own choices about everything from what to eat for breakfast to what to study in graduate school. Simple decisions paralyzed me. Walking through a grocery store, I'd find myself reaching for foods Marcus preferred before remembering that his preferences didn't matter anymore. I'd start to turn down social invitations automatically before realizing that no one was monitoring my schedule. No one was keeping track of how I spent my time or who I spent it with. It took months of therapy, real therapy this time, with a trauma specialist who understood psychological abuse, to understand that my confusion wasn't weakness. It was a normal response to having my autonomy systematically stripped away over years of subtle manipulation. Dr. Angela Reeves, my therapist in Portland, helped me understand something crucial. Marcus hadn't just controlled my actions, he controlled my thoughts, my sense of reality, my understanding of what was normal in a relationship. Recovering from that kind of psychological programming takes time and patience with yourself. You didn't just escape an abusive marriage, Dr. Reeves told me during one of our sessions. You escaped a cult of one, where you were the only member and Marcus was the leader who controlled everything you believed about yourself and your world. That perspective helped me forgive myself for staying as long as I did, for not recognizing the abuse sooner, for the extreme measures I'd taken to get free. When you're trapped in someone else's version of reality, sometimes extreme measures are the only way out. But healing wasn't just about therapy and self-forgiveness. It was also about reconnecting with the people Marcus had systematically removed from my life. Jennifer Park and I talk every week now, sometimes for hours. She told me she'd never stopped worrying about me during those years when our friendship faded, had sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to help. You seemed happy in your photos, she said. But there was something missing from your eyes, like you weren't really there anymore. My sister Amy flew out to visit me last month, the first time we'd spent meaningful time together in 3 years. We talked about how Marcus had subtly discouraged family gatherings, how he'd always had conflicts or obligations whenever Amy wanted to visit, how he'd made me feel guilty for choosing family time over couple time. I thought you were just being a typical newlywed, Amy admitted. Prioritizing your marriage, creating your own family unit. I didn't realize he was isolating you from us deliberately. These conversations were painful but necessary. I had to face how completely I'd abandoned the relationships that mattered to me, how I'd allowed one person's opinion of me to override everyone else's, including my own. The other women from Marcus's past became an unexpected source of support and healing. Catherine and I meet for coffee whenever she's in Portland for business. She's become something like a big sister, someone who understands exactly what I went through because she lived through it too. The hardest part, Catherine told me recently, isn't getting away from them. It's trusting yourself again, believing that your instincts are reliable, that your feelings matter. Jessica Chen and I collaborated on an article for a legal journal about recognizing financial abuse in marriages. She's rebuilt her career brilliantly. She's now a partner at a firm in Denver that specializes in representing domestic abuse victims. Turning her experience with Marcus into expertise that helps other women felt like the ultimate victory over his attempts to destroy her. But perhaps the most meaningful connection I've made is with Dr. Patricia Kim, the psychiatrist who evaluated Marcus in 2015. When Detective Harrison contacted her as part of the follow-up investigation, she was horrified to learn how Marcus had used her clinical assessment as a blueprint for his behavior rather than seeking treatment. I've been practicing psychology for 20 years, she told me when we met for lunch last year. But I've never encountered someone who so deliberately embraced their pathology. Most people with personality disorders at least try to rationalize their behavior or minimize the harm they cause. Marcus seemed to take pride in his ability to manipulate people. Dr. Kim has become a mentor to me as I work toward my own psychology degree. She's helping me understand the clinical aspects of what Marcus was, not to excuse his behavior, but to recognize the warning signs so I can help other people identify predators before they become victims. Because that's what I'm doing now with my life, turning my experience into expertise that can protect other women. I work part-time at a women's crisis center in Portland, helping intake new clients who are escaping abusive relationships. Many of them have stories similar to mine: gradual isolation, financial control, psychological manipulation that was so subtle they didn't recognize it as abuse until it was almost too late. He never hit me, they say, echoing words I used to say. He never called me names or obviously threatened me. I know other people have it worse. I help them understand that abuse doesn't always look like what we see in movies. Sometimes it looks like a husband who gradually takes over all financial decisions. Sometimes it looks like someone who has an opinion about every outfit you wear, every friend you see, every goal you set for yourself. Sometimes it looks like someone who loves you so much that they just want to protect you from making mistakes, even if those mistakes are actually just signs of your independence. The crisis center work led to speaking opportunities. I've given presentations at law schools about recognizing coercive control, at medical schools about the health impacts of psychological abuse, at universities about the connection between domestic violence and financial abuse. I always tell my audiences the same thing. If someone in your life is gradually making your world smaller, making you question your own judgment, making you feel like you're lucky to be loved by them despite your flaws, that's not love. That's ownership. And no one has the right to own another person. Last month, I got an email that reminded me why this work matters so much. A woman named Rachel attended one of my presentations in Seattle and recognized her own relationship patterns in my descriptions of coercive control. She's now safely out of that relationship and rebuilding her life, but she wanted to thank me for giving her the vocabulary to understand what was happening to her. "I thought I was just in a bad marriage," she wrote. "I didn't know I was being systematically broken down by someone who saw me as a project to be controlled rather than a person to be loved." Emails like Rachel's remind me that Marcus's death accomplished something beyond just ending his personal reign of terror. It created an opportunity to educate people about a form of abuse that's often invisible until it's too late. I won't lie to you, there are still nights when I wonder if I could have found another way, if I could have escaped Marcus without letting him die. But then I remember Catherine's police report from 2011, Jessica's destroyed career, the files of women whose lives he'd systematically ruined. I remember that Marcus was already interviewing my replacement, already planning to do to someone else exactly what he'd done to me. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to remove them permanently from the equation. I'm not advocating for vigilante justice or encouraging anyone to take the law into their own hands. What I did was dangerous, illegal, and could have destroyed my life if any part of my plan had gone wrong. But I also won't pretend to be sorry that Marcus Morrison can never hurt another woman again. What I hope you take from my story isn't that revenge is the answer, it's that you are stronger than you know, smarter than your abuser wants you to believe, and worthy of a life where you make your own choices about everything from your career to your friendships to what you eat for dinner. If you're in a relationship where someone is gradually taking control of your life, where you find yourself constantly second-guessing your own judgment, where you feel like you're walking on eggshells to avoid conflict, please trust your instincts. Your feelings are valid. Your concerns are real. You deserve better. And if you're watching this from somewhere in the world where you recognize yourself in my story, where someone is making you feel small and crazy and trapped, please know that escape is possible. Not the way I did it. There are safer, legal ways to get free. But freedom is possible, and healing is possible, and a life where you get to be yourself is not just a dream. It's your right. If my story has resonated with you, if you've seen yourself in my experiences or recognized warning signs in your own relationships, please share this video. Not for me, but for the women who might need to hear it, who might be living in beautiful prisons like I was, who might need someone to tell them that they're not crazy, they're not imagining things, and they're not alone. You are stronger than you know. You are worth more than they tell you. And your life, your real life, the one where you make your own choices, is waiting for you to claim it. My name is Sarah Chen, and I survived Marcus Morrison. More than that, I'm thriving in ways he never wanted me to believe were possible. You can too. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, you are not alone.